Get your notebook. There's more.
Welcome to episode 14 of CN Live. I'm Elizabeth Voss.
And I'm Joe Lauria, editor-in-chief of Consortium News.
The impeachment inquiry being led behind closed doors by the U.S. House Intelligence Committee against Donald Trump continues to heat up, with more witnesses coming forward to say Trump withheld military aid to Ukraine while asking for investigations in that country into Joe Biden and his son, as well as information that might shed light on the conspiracy theory of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. We'll have a panel of journalists and a former U.S. counterintelligence officer to discuss the latest developments.
We now turn to the issue that is consuming Washington, D.C., and I imagine much of the rest of the country, and tearing society apart in terms of extreme partisanship that's being displayed here. And to discuss this, we're joined in upstate New York by Scott Ritter. Scott, of course, is a former UN weapons inspector, and he's now a political analyst with very good insights into the intelligence community. So we are really going to welcome Scott's input on that. Thank you, Scott Ritter, for joining us. And in San Antonio, Texas, is Scott Horton. Scott is a radio host. He's the host of the Scott Horton Show. And I think all of us have been a guest on that show one time or another. So thank you for joining CN Live, Scott.
Happy to be here. Austin, though.
All right, Austin. Up here in the Northeast, same thing, same difference. Same difference. Austin, that's right. Peter B. Collins is also a radio host, longtime voice, heard in the San Francisco Bay Area, and he's joining us, as he has several times, on CN Live. And thank you, Peter. And I'm looking forward to all three of you in what I think is going to be a freewheeling discussion on a very complex and fraught issue, impeachment. I want to just throw this out here because Scott Ritter, last time you were on, you said that there was a procedural impropriety by the House Democrats, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker in particular, that she hadn't called a vote in order to begin this inquiry. Now, the White House, after you said that, in fact, responded that way. They weren't going to cooperate because you have to have a vote on the House floor first to start a proper inquiry. The Democrats, I didn't invite the dog to the discussion, but you might hear something intelligent from that. Scott, the House Democrat, Pelosi just said this week that she didn't need to have a vote. Now, I looked into this a little bit. I don't see any firm rules or laws or anything in the House says that they do have to first vote, that there can be an inquiry first. And I think that's what happened with Nixon, but it was in the Judiciary Committee, not the Intelligence Committee. So, Scott, what do you say about that? And then the others can join in, just to get the procedural issue out of the way.
When we speak about impeachment, we're not talking about a legal process per se. It's a political process. Legally speaking, the Democrats are right. There is no rule, there is no law, there is nothing set forth in the Constitution that requires a floor vote, before we move on. The recent precedent suggests that this is a politically wise decision to make, especially when you're talking about overturning the will of the American people by removing an American president through a process that does not involve, an election. And so, I again will say this, void of a House vote, this process, which is already very politicized, will lack, the kind of credibility that vote will give, and will lessen, I believe, the enthusiasm of the American people to view whatever comes out of this process as legitimate. Already, over close to 50% of the American people view this process as illegitimate. Not that they don't support the impeachment, that the process is illegitimate. And if the Democrats succeed in impeaching this president with this kind of mindset in the American people, they're just going to further divide an already divided American public and make whoever replaces Trump, whether it's in a year or in 4 years, it make their job that much more difficult when it comes to governing this country.
Well, they wouldn't be able to impeach him without a floor vote, obviously. That would be the impeachment vote. But you're saying that people would still be upset they didn't have a vote first to start this investigation.
Again, we're talking about a process here. Yes, of course, there won't be an impeachment without a floor vote, but the processes that take place prior to that vote will lack legitimacy in the eyes of many Americans.
Peter or Scott, you want to weigh in on that issue?
Sure. First of all, I do support impeachment for Trump, but I think that the current Ukraine focus is risky and wobbly. To Scott's direct point, he is correct. The House makes its own rules, essentially, regarding impeachment. And I generally agree with him that it would be stronger if the Democrats took a full vote. I also think it would force Republicans to take a position, which I think is a worthwhile exercise as well. And fundamentally, I think she has flawed strategy, that she still believes that her majority, which was created by recruiting very conservative Democrats, people from the national security and military, and even former Republicans. You know, the Orange County wave here in California included 3 candidates who had been registered Republicans before they were recruited by the Democrats to run. And so her majority is squishy, and she has this idea that she can protect her members who are vulnerable if they don't have to take a stand on impeachment. And I think that this is flawed because she fails to recognize that she could easily lose her majority following a massive tweet storm by Trump against the squad, against other members of the Democratic Party, and it may have nothing to do with impeachment. So my feeling is that she is trying to protect people who ultimately will have to face a vote anyway, and I think it's a mistaken approach.
Scott Horton, anything on the procedure you'd like to weigh in on?
Well, I haven't been following it that closely, but it seems like everything I read about what's come out in the testimony so far are essentially paraphrased leaks of private or secret hearings. And that seems to me, I don't know how irregular that is. Doesn't seem like they impeach anybody very often. But this guy Volker testified for 7 hours or something. And then we get to read about what somebody said he said instead of reading what he said. So I don't know if that's right. I may have just not seen enough of what's been published about all of that, but that's all of what I had noticed. And I guess I echo what Peter said about supporting impeachment, but I would strenuously object to using this Ukraine thing to do it. It's sort of like essentially, I mean, I would let me prosecute him and I could convict him and have him thrown out for all his war crimes in Yemen, no problem. His real crimes that he's committed as president, there are plenty of them. But instead, what's happening here is the CIA is taking him out because they don't like him. And they tried it before with fake accusations of treason. And now they're trying again because apparently, and I think they should be presumed guilty on this and him innocent on this. It sure seems like they sent a CIA officer up there to find something else on the guy, which probably wasn't too hard to do. Although I think the Ukraine scandal is, in comparison to something like what's going on in Yemen is essentially nothing. But I would like to see him impeached and removed and prosecuted for war crimes, but I don't want to see the CIA get away the whole time. They've announced even since the summer of 2016 that they're on a mission to stop this guy from being president. I mean, when Mike Morrell wrote in the New York Times that this guy is an agent of Russia, I mean, that right there was crossing the line, and the rest of the whole Russia scandal. These guys, they act like the CIA is a separate and co-equal and maybe superior branch of government to all the rest. And so, yes, he should be taken out, but in no circumstances should these CIA guys and FBI counterintelligence types be the ones who have the chance to get away with what is obviously much more of a coup than anything like a coup against a foreign entity from outside the establishment who should have never been elected by that establishment, by that state, protecting itself from outsiders, rather than anything like an application of the law, even against this quite lawless president.
Yeah. Now you're getting into the politics of it, which is I wanted to introduce. And I was going to introduce it by saying I think this is one of the 6 ways from Sunday. And I think, Scott, we're starting to get into that. What do you think, Scott Ritter?
Absolutely. Look, this is a president who is as anti-establishment as you can get when it comes to the entities that oversee the governance of this country. And one of these entities is the intelligence community, the power that has been vested in the intelligence community to stick its nose into just about every aspect of American life, whether it's the FBI and their massive monitoring of communications, or the CIA in carrying out covert policy that isn't directed by a Congress that's held accountable to the American people. What we see here is a CIA, and this is one of the things I have. I have no problem with the President of the United States being held to account if he violates the law or if he does things that are in such gross deviation from the norm that Congress would say he has failed to live up to his obligations to serve the best interests of the United States. No problem there. I do have a problem with a process that legitimizes something that isn't legitimate. For instance, we have a whistleblower. They say that his testimony is protected under the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Statute, but it's not. See, the whistleblower statute is designed to allow people who are inside the intelligence community, understanding that much of what the intelligence community is secret and therefore should be protected, to alert members of Congress to wrongdoing by the intelligence community. It is not intended for a member of the intelligence community to rat out the President of the United States. And that is what has happened here. The President of the United States is not the intelligence community. His conversations, however wrong or right they may be, are not something that the intelligence community gets to report to Congress. This is not how it works. And by allowing this to happen, you have politicized the CIA to an extent that is inherently incompatible with American principles of democracy. And that's my major complaint here. You know, whether or not the president violated the sensibilities of America to the, you know, vis-a-vis Ukraine to the point that it warrants impeachment, that's one issue. How we're getting to this point by weaponizing the intelligence community is unacceptable, and no American, whether you support impeachment or not, should allow this process to be legitimized in this fashion by the United States Congress. This is a partisan witch hunt. This is a coup by another name, whatever you want to call it. It's just not how we're supposed to operate as a country.
Well, I wanted to add that Scott Ritter also has a background in counterintelligence in the U.S. Marines. Peter B., just on the overall question of whether is this an intelligence agency operation? Is this whistleblower somebody put up by the intelligence community? He was a member of the CIA, was seconded to the White House at the National Security Council. We now learn that Adam Schiff, the chairman of the Intelligence Committee that's running this impeachment inquiry, originally said that he had not met the whistleblower, and now we found out that, in fact, the whistleblower came to see Schiff's staff just before he filed his whistleblower complaint, and after Schiff's staff recommended lawyers to him, and it looks like lawyers wrote that because it has footnotes in it and whatnot. So just before we get into the details of what Trump is accused of doing, whether that raises to the level of impeachment or not, Rudy Giuliani's role, just keep that for aside for the minute. Do you think this is, as I said, what Chuck Schumer said to Rachel Maddow, that if you go against the intelligence community, they have 6 ways from Sunday to get you, and I think this is one of them. What do you think, Peter?
I think one of the telling signs is that this is the first whistleblower, arguably in the last 8 or 10 years, that Adam Schiff has embraced. And the fundamental notion, as Scott pointed out, that a serving officer or employee at the CIA would use the whistleblower channel to call out these particular issues, which the story's emerging, and we'll talk more about that. But fundamentally, the origins of this are as suspicious as the origins of Russiagate. And we really do need to acknowledge that, you know, we don't know the identity. We don't even know any details about the argument of the second alleged whistleblower. Adam Schiff is now saying, and there is a real issue of the way that Trump has attempted to intimidate the witness, claim that he has a right to face his accuser. That's bullshit. It doesn't apply in this setting. And so, we do have to separate the smoke from, actual issues here. But I'm very skeptical of the way that this surfaced. And you are correct that Adam Schiff has been caught lying about the timeline of events, so what he knew and when he knew it. And that is a serious issue, which I consider to be more significant than the procedural matter of whether there's been a full House vote. The credibility of the process is more important than the process itself, in my view.
Now, Peter, before I bring Elizabeth in, I wanted to just throw out one. You mentioned Russiagate. I think there's two big backgrounds to this story. One is the U.S. helped overthrow the government of Ukraine in 2014. And a couple of months later, Joe Biden's son winds up on this board. A prosecutor was looking into the board. Biden says openly in a meeting that he withheld $1 billion in credit until that prosecutor was fired. That prosecutor testified under oath in a court case in Austria that's why he was fired, because he was looking into it. So that's something we want to look at. But Russiagate is the other big background here. They failed to get Trump on Russiagate, on the collusion narrative. And this looks like Russiagate too, without question. And why? Because Bill Barr and John Durham are running an investigation to look into the origins of Russiagate. Trump was justifiably angry about this whole thing. He's ordered to find out how this all started. Plus, the Inspector General at the Department of Justice has already completed his report into the possible misuse of the Pfizer Act to get a warrant based on spying on the Trump campaign through Carter Page. So that report's waiting to be released. And then there's Durham and Barr flying around the world getting information to try to get to the roots of this. If, in fact, there is something done that was some real wrongdoing by the intelligence community in the original Russiagate narrative, I think that they're worried about what's coming out, and I see this as a preemptive attack to raise this telephone call with the president of Ukraine into an impeachment proceeding as going on offense, because they need to play defense here, to try to preempt what's coming down the pike, possibly from Durham and Barr and the IG. Let's get everybody's, Scott Horton and Scott Ritter's views on that, and then Elizabeth Voss will take over.
Well, so Trump is in this ironic position where he's the most powerful man in the world, but why? It's because he controls the CIA and the Pentagon and the FBI, and they are the world army, right? Without them, what is he except some guy in a room? And so here he's mad as hell, and he has, you would think, some way of getting back at these guys for what they've done to him, except what instrument does he have other than the Department of Justice itself, which is never going to get to the bottom of anything. And so here he's got Durham. And the only reason anybody already knows his name is because he's the guy that Obama and Holder hired to let Bush and his CIA guys get away with torture and murder. And including, they held a preliminary investigation to see whether they would hold an event for actually death, Gul Rahman at the salt pit torture dungeon in Afghanistan, and Jamal al-Ramadi, I think his name was, tortured to death by the CIA at the Abu Ghraib prison. And Durham essentially dragged it out and then canceled the whole thing and let him go. He was also in charge of investigating Jose Rodriguez and the others for the obstruction of justice and the destruction of all the videotapes of the torture sessions, and let them all go on that too. And so this is, I don't know anything else about him other than his track record on letting, looking forward, not backward, when it came to the completely illegal Bush torture regime. And so he's a reliable guy, reliable exactly for who? I don't know. I mean, maybe this guy Barr has such a commitment to the executive branch in a David Addison way that he actually will be so loyal to Trump himself that he will see this through to some extraordinary degree. And Trump has to be crossing his fingers and praying for that. And I think that it's a very fair presumption that you find all kinds of insanely, highly scandalous scandal at the origins of Russiagate. No doubt. The whole thing was a frame up from the beginning. We already know that. And so, and just by looking at the different FBI assets and CIA assets that were infiltrated into the Trump group to try to get them to parrot back some Russian propaganda talking points at them and that kind of thing.
So you don't think, Scott, that the impeachment is a preemptive move by the Democrats and the intelligence agencies against what Durham and Barr may come up with?
No, I agree with you on that, that's a pretty good motive for this. I mean, they probably would do the same thing without that, and they may fear what's coming there, but I certainly would not bet on an IG report to be any better than any other IG report, right? Like, yeah, the Contras might have sold some cocaine, but surely no white guys at CIA headquarters knew that. Here, print that. You know, what are we going to get any better from them, you know?
Scott Ritter.
The bottom line is the CIA can't be trusted on this. We've had a discussion in the past about the role that John Brennan played in creating the foundation for what turned into Russiagate. And we need to keep that name in the back of our mind. John Brennan, together with other senior levels of the Central Intelligence Agency and the intelligence community, were dead set against Donald Trump being elected. And they were part and parcel of this thinking that said, we as loyal Americans, because apparently the only way you can be defined as a loyal American nowadays is to have membership in the intelligence community of the FBI. As loyal Americans, it's incumbent upon us to ensure that this man, who I think just about everybody who didn't vote for him believes is unfit for office, we have to prevent him from becoming president of the United States. And we see with the desperation in which Brennan was acting in the summer of 2016, the fall of 2016, to inject intelligence that he today admits was probably wrong, to inject this into the political process. And the reason why I bring up Brennan is that he wasn't acting alone within the intelligence community. He had a stable of senior management. He had a stable of dedicated analysts who were committed to this process. The analysts who worked with him on his fusion cell starting in July of 2016 to shape the Steele dossier, to shape questionable NSA signals intelligence, to shape information that came from probably what is a Russian double agent into data that was presented to the president, presented to Congress in a way that undermined the legitimacy of Donald Trump. These people still exist. And I'm very worried about the origins of this whistleblower. This is a person that obviously has a political bias, somebody who has expressed a political affiliation with one of Donald Trump's primary political opponents, somebody who, just based upon his resume, seems to be highly susceptible to buying into the notion of the need for an insurance policy to ensure that Trump does not retain office. I believe that this is a set-up job by members of the intelligence community, not in an official capacity, but this is part of the cabal of politicized intelligence operatives. And it's, believe me, it's not the first time that this has happened. If you go back to the era of Ronald Reagan, the CIA and the intelligence community was politicized in support of Republican agendas. The undermining of Jimmy Carter was something that was real. The undermining of Bill Clinton by the CIA in the early days was something that was real. And we see today the CIA having been politicized in the other direction is undermining Donald Trump. And this is a problem. I honestly believe that when this is all said and done, if the United States is going to restore any credibility in the institutions of democracy, the intelligence community is going to have to be disbanded, broken down, and rebuilt in a way that allows for proper congressional oversight.
And you know that they will do whatever they can to stop that. And
Absolutely.
this is part of it, maybe, this impeachment hearing. Pete, if you want to add something. Yeah, Scott. Yeah, just jump right in. Jump right in.
Scott, can you elaborate what you were talking about there about the CIA versus Clinton in his early days?
I'll give you a couple prime examples. One, when Bill Clinton came in, he had reached out to the Iraqi government in an effort to resolve the issue of sanctions, to bring Iraq back into the family of the international community. I know this because I spoke with the Iraqi oil minister, who said he was in secret negotiations with Clinton transition people in Amman, Jordan, prior to Clinton becoming president. What happens immediately after Bill Clinton assumes office. We have an assassination attempt against George Herbert Walker Bush in Kuwait, which turns out to have been a 100% fabricated affair. It was collusion between the CIA and Kuwaiti intelligence to create an incident that forced Bill Clinton to back away from repairing relations with Saddam, and instead, he began a process of attacking Iraqi intelligence and beginning the process of regime change embracing. And that's what I mean by the CIA politicizing itself.
We love bold statements on this show, Scott, but can you back that up somehow? How do you know that that was fabricated?
Well, we know it several ways. One, I'm probably one of the few Americans that has actually inspected the Iraqi intelligence service. I'm probably one of the few Americans prior to 2003 who sat down with senior Iraqi intelligence officers, including the deputy head of Iraqi intelligence, to discuss this very issue. The Iraqis have said from day one, we were not involved in this. Our fingerprints aren't on this. And I was unable to find any evidence of Iraqi involvement. Two, we can speak of circumstantial evidence. We own Iraq, or at least we did own Iraq after 2003. We occupied the Iraqi intelligence services. We brought into our custody every single one of these Iraqi intelligence officers. Now, are you trying to tell me, or is anybody trying to suggest that having full possession of Iraqi intelligence archives, of having the ability to interrogate every single one of these Iraqi intelligence officers, that we haven't uncovered any evidence of an Iraqi plot to kill George Herbert Walker Bush? And if we had uncovered that, we wouldn't have broadcast this, published it, etc. Instead, we simply don't talk about it. We simply don't talk about it. Now, the FBI has come out and done their own investigation and found that the these poor smugglers that were captured by Kuwaiti intelligence and interrogated, they were tortured. Their confessions were tortured, and as a result of that torture, much of this case was built. As an American, we can't accept tortured confessions as evidence. So the only evidence we have to back up these allegations are tortured confessions. We also have the explosives. The explosives themselves that were linked to this were traced to Iraqi military explosives that were left behind in Kuwait after the end of the Gulf War. Now, so you're telling me the Iraqis are so good that they will abandon explosives in Kuwait, then go back in, grab these explosives, take them to Iraq, reform them into car bombs, and smuggle them back into Kuwait. The United States today, after occupying Iraq, taking control of Iraqi intelligence archives, and being able to interrogate every single Iraqi intelligence official, has not come up with any information, any document, any confession that says Iraq did this. We have tapes from Saddam Hussein that says we didn't do this. We have a lot of information that says this never happened, but we have no evidence to suggest that this in fact took place.
Is that a police dog coming after you?
That is that Pomeranian with attitude.
Goodness, I hope you're not saying the wrong thing. Peter, with the other dog over there, you want to weigh in before Elizabeth comes on, please?
Yeah, I'm pleased that my dog is behaving so far. First of all, I want to reference that Scott wrote an excellent piece for Consortium News. This is 6 weeks ago. I did a podcast interview with him afterward. And we do agree that there are important threads of the origins of Russiagate that deserve a full investigation. And I'll touch on those in a moment. Like Scott Horton, with John Durham as Bill Barr's sidekick in this international romp, I don't have any confidence that we're going to see a credible counter-narrative or evidence of what I suspect and what Ritter and I agree on, that John Brennan has been the scriptwriter for this narrative. I think that's pretty clear. What I believe we need to see is what Stephen Halper was doing. He's a guy who's often ignored in the whole Russiagate story, but he was on the CIA or Pentagon payroll in six figures, and he appears to be central to whatever was going on in the early stages. that connected with the Australian ambassador, with Richard Dearlove, the former MI6 chief, with Christopher Steele. And Fusion GPS has not been properly investigated. We know that there was a husband and wife team there. The wife worked at Fusion and the husband at the FBI. So I am open to learning the truth about where all this came from. I am dubious that Bill Barr and John Durham are going to deliver it to us. That said, Trump often operates on hunches that he exaggerates himself. But it's fair to say that officials in Ukraine played a role in 2016 in exposing Manafort's cash payments from that Black Ledger book. And I think Trump is obsessed with that. It is one of those leads that turned into a conviction. And, Paul Manafort's overseas activities and his tax dodging, in my view, don't criminalize Trump. He made a bad decision to take him on as a volunteer campaign manager. And like so many people, Manafort, Flynn, Jared Kushner, and now Rudy Giuliani, they have been running these scams with or without Trump's full knowledge. And so some of this is useful to Democrats to support what is a largely exaggerated narrative in Russiagate. At the same time, I don't discount what we have learned, and Scott Horton, you're correct, the way this process is going, where these subjects are being interviewed behind closed doors, and then whatever their power quotes are, their pull quotes are leaked within hours, if not in time for the next day's morning newspapers. At the same time, what we're hearing from Kurt Volker, I believe that Trump's phone call with Zelensky on July 25th showed Trump to be a very skilled grifter. He didn't quite cross the line of quid pro quo, in my opinion. But Volker's texts and the dangling of a White House invitation to Zelensky in exchange for pursuing some form of investigation of the Bidens and of 2016, the Black Ledger, this is turning into what I consider to be a somewhat credible story. Again, we have to question the origins, just like we did in Russiagate, okay? Where did this start? And we have to be uncomfortable that it came from the intelligence community. But to me, when Fiona Hill, and again, this is leaked information, says that John Bolton went ballistic after a July 10 meeting, I've never expected, any standard of morality or justice from John Bolton. And if this, even offended Mr. Mustache, then, we're starting to see the outlines of something that could be real. And so I'm prepared to let these investigations go forward, but I remain skeptical of the origins. And just to complete the thread about the Russiagate investigation, the FISA court, as Joe mentioned, is another critical issue. But what we've seen is even Reggie Walton, who is as hard line as they come, when he presided over the FISA court, he routinely criticized the presentations coming from mostly the FBI, but secondarily NSA and CIA, about lies that were told in the FISA court to justify warrants and investigations. And I fundamentally believe the FISA court has no place in our system of government. And I'd love to see all of that exposed, but we know that neither party will lead any significant reforms. So
Peter,
we kind of get stuck in this house of mirrors.
Peter, on Bolton, I mean, this is an impeached witness. I mean, he has an axe to grind. He was just fired by the idea that he would be horrified. Here's a guy who went to see the head of the OPCW, the UN chemical weapons, and threatened his children if he didn't write a report a favorable report about Iraq. They needed this report so that they could build their case to invade Iraq. And here the head of the UN chemical weapons team was saying that he had a positive view of it, and he threatened his children. This is the way the U.S. conducts foreign policy. Threats, bribes, intimidation. They got votes for the 1991 Gulf War by telling Yemen, you lost $70 million in aid for not voting with us. Before the 2003 invasion, as we know from Catherine Gunn, they spied on the missions to get leverage, blackmailable material. We know from the way John Bolton negotiated threatening aid cutoffs from countries that wouldn't agree to bilateral agreements with the U.S. to give immunity to the U.S. troops before the International Criminal Court. So Bolton, forget about Bolton, sorry. But if in fact Trump did do this, and he very likely did, put out military aid in exchange for these investigations and information about the origins of Russiagate, he was just following this long corrupt tradition. So to throw their hands up in the air and say, oh my God, it's shocking what they heard. I mean, this is just ridiculous and very, very hard to believe. That's anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Well, I don't dispute anything that you said about John Bolton, and I am surprised to see him surface in this context. But what about Rexon Tillerson? He has come forward saying that he left the Oval Office stunned that he had been asked to join in a swap. And now we hear that Giuliani was trying to repeatedly engineer the extradition of Fethullah Gulen, who I always credit Joe Lauria as the only reporter who's ever gone to Pennsylvania to interview him.
Well, it was the first, not the only.
All right.
Two days later, the New York Times came. But anyway,
all right.
Let's hold off Giuliani for a second, because I want to do a whole section on him if I can.
Okay.
But I just wanted to say that Trump's mistake, in my view here, was to bring this up in the conversation with Zelensky. Should have left this to the Department of Justice and to his personal lawyer that we're going to get to, Rudy Giuliani, to dig up any kind of information they needed to from Ukraine. Once the president gets involved, he's broken that wall between the Department of Justice and the White House, and that taints everything as political. Elizabeth, you've been sitting there patiently. Can you please jump in? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think this is a great point to kind of skip beyond whether it's a legitimate investigation and just ask all of you, what difference do you think this would make in 2020 if we hypothetically assume that there would be a successful impeachment process? Just skipping all of the whys and the hows and all of that. What would that actually mean for 2020? Would that make a difference? I mean, it would obviously be a very different situation compared with the successful impeachment in 2017. So what difference does this make? And does it actually provide any sort of deflective cover for Democrats?
Can you clarify what you mean? Do you mean impeachment and removal, or just the House
No,
majority?
I mean the whole thing. Just assuming for a moment, hypothetically, that were to happen, what would come next? What would that
I was
mean?
just talking, so I'll let other people go.
Okay.
I don't think there's much of a chance that the Senate will remove him. I mean, I think probably what will happen is he'll be impeached and survive. And as far as it looks right now, I think he'll safely win re-election if you look at what weak losers all the Democrats are and how he has a great argument that I beat him and they've been trying to cheat and overturn the election and frame me up and go on these fishing expeditions and witch hunts ever since then. And no matter how criminal he is, he's right about that. And they've made it clear that's exactly what they're doing. So they've made a perfect victim out of him as far as his narrative goes for his side. And what a position to be in. An incumbent president who's running against the establishment. But then the question is whether he's going to actually do anything outside of their interests. And I think that, there must be some powerful interests who disapprove of his tariffs on China and stuff like that. But I don't think anybody really powerful has much of an interest in pulling us out of the Middle East. There are plenty of arms dealers who want to keep us there. But the Kochs are probably the most powerful people who'd like to see us out of there, but they don't care that much. I mean, they finance the good guys at Cato, and that's great. But
you mean the
it's
Koch?
Not enough to make the difference.
The Koch. There's only one of them now.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, one of them died. But Charles Koch, the one that's still alive, was the most active political one anyway, I think. But they're the only real anti-war guys who have that much money and influence inside the parties on a mega donor status. Everybody else is happy with the status quo. So Trump, I think, could really rally his base by pulling the troops out of some of the 8 or 10 wars we're fighting right now. And I think he knows that he can jerk his base around with promises like that, and that's what they want to hear. but it remains to be seen whether anyone will hold him accountable and make him continue with stuff like that. We certainly see the establishment goes absolutely crazy when he draws some troops out of northeastern Syria. So if he want to keep jerking their chain, he should continue doing the same thing. And he's got Afghanistan, Yemen, Iraq War 3.5. We're still fighting over there. He's got the drone war in Libya, infantry and special operations guys killing people in Somalia. So many wars to end, and so many, opportunities to make the Democrats shriek about how we got to keep the wars going longer and see how that works out for them. So that's the smart politics, and that's a sure way to survive impeachment and removal if he's ending a war every couple of months and rallying his base around that. But I guess we'll see what happens. I'm not betting on
it. To answer your question, though, Elizabeth, I mean, I agree with Scott. I don't think the Senate's going to remove him. But your question was predicated on the assumption that he's gone. Right. He's finished. And I will tell you right now, my firm belief that if that happens, we have weaponized impeachment politically. And there will not be a single president that will survive a full term. Not in this day, not in the day of divided America. If you want to create the preconditions for a civil war, and I'm not talking about discussion, I'm talking about the kind that involve guns and dead Americans in the streets of American cities, in the fields of America, because that's the direction we're heading to. We're already a nation that's inclined towards violence. We have more guns per capita than just about anybody, and we have people who are inclined to use these weapons. This is a very dangerous situation. Now, what normally prevents a country from going insane and getting involved in the kind of self-destruction is the rule of law, is a commonly held belief by those on the left and the right and in the middle that the rule of law is all important, and that we will subordinate our individual political passion to rules which give us the opportunity to articulate these passions and to act on them responsibly. The impeachment of the President of the United States under the current conditions is the most irresponsible political act one can imagine. And if it goes through and takes place, there won't be a single American president who will survive the first term without some sort of impeachment procedure taking place. And as we know, whether it succeeds or fails, impeachment paralyzes the political dynamic in this country, which in turn will only further flame the passions of an American population that is already passionate, already divided, and thank goodness to date hasn't shown a predilection towards violence, but that day may end if they lose faith in the rule of law as a viable vehicle for allowing their political passions to be heard.
So I don't disagree, Scott, that there is a risk of violent reaction if Trump were to be removed from office, but I don't think we should be intimidated by that. And I agree with you about the importance of observing the rule of law. And it's why I don't believe that the Ukrainian story is the best route to impeachment for the Democrats. He is dead convicted by Michael Cohen's plea deal of paying hush money to Stormy Daniels and the Playboy Playmate and covering it up. He directed that. And it, to me, is the clear-cut case of his criminality that, impeachment could be the basis of. I don't know why the Democrats prefer the Ukrainian narrative. They claim that it's clear-cut and simple, and the average American can understand it. And I just don't think that's true. There's so many people here, so many moving parts, so many layers to it. And so strategically, I disagree with the Democrats with their emphasis on Ukraine. I also think that it's crazy that they think that they can pump out articles of impeachment by Thanksgiving and wrap up a trial in the Senate before the end of the year. I think that's very wishful on their part. And so, I see a lot of pitfalls here, but I don't agree with your point that Trump, doesn't deserve impeachment. So, you know, I think that this is where we do have some points in common and some points in divergence. I also think that Trump has divided America in such a way that it will take a long time to repair. And, you know, the Democrats are not putting up strong candidates. I agree with Scott Horton on that. But we somehow have to move through the mess that we are stuck in right now. And just like the withdrawal from Syria, it's not going to be pretty.
Peter, if I could suggest why they're using Ukraine and nothing else. Because in Ukraine, you may have some of the origins of Russiagate that Rudy Giuliani's been digging up. And in Ukraine, you've got the Biden corruption. And Biden is in big trouble. So they want to cut this off at the path. To change the story from the very likely corruption that Biden has admitted to himself, because he did what they're accusing Trump of doing, which is withholding money to get something from a foreign leader. So Ukraine is at the heart of the 2020 campaign. They could use the narrative that he's trying to get Ukraine to interfere in the next election, to invade our country, as so many of those dopes on the Democratic stage were saying that Russia had invaded us in the last election, and they're going to do it again. Now here's Ukraine. They're bringing Ukraine into it. So Ukraine is right at the center of this, of both Russiagate and the last election and this election. That's why I think they chose Ukraine.
Well, and we have massive amounts of denial on both sides. When Scott Ritter referred to, you know, the potential for violence by Trump supporters, I think that they are openly in denial about the criminal wrongdoing of this president. And I join Scott Horton in identifying war crimes here, not simply process crimes and gotcha cases ginned up by the intelligence community. And so I can't explain the Democratic strategy. My local congressman, Jared Huffman, had a town hall. I talked to him there the other night, and I said, look, I don't think Ukrainegate, pardon me, is the right route to impeachment, because there are major unexploded ordinances for Democrats. And you reference Biden. I think he's done. He really cannot extricate himself from this. And it's another case of the Democrats promoting a candidate with open self-inflicted wounds and pretending that rely on CNN and the New York Times in the most recent debate, where they asked him a perfunctory question about his son and Ukraine. They allowed him to deny it. They turned to Bernie Sanders to comment on it. He changed the subject, and then they moved on. The moderators just shut down any discussion of Joe Biden. And we also see the routine claims in the media that all of the Ukraine stuff has been investigated and there's nothing there. That's simply not true. We haven't had an objective investigation of Joe or Hunter Biden. It's a bunch of you know, claims and counterclaims that are reduced to exoneration by the corporate media in their effort to protect Biden.
Peter, are you telling me that the DNC is unwilling to run a candidate that has self-inflicted wounds? I'm shocked. But I wanted to ask you, though, and ask all of you again. So the same question, but flipping it on its head. So what happens then, assuming that the impeachment attempt does fail, which I agree with you all is much more likely? And to build a little bit on what Joe just said about the fact that, you know, Ukraine is the center of so much that we've been looking at in the last 2 or 3 years. Do you think that this is essentially a way to extend the resistance battle cry through 2020, maybe a failed candidate running against Trump in a way that would deflect from the DNC's shortcomings? What do you think happens next, not only in terms of Trump's reelection, which I agree is more likely because of this scandal, and also, though, the survivability of the DNC after this? I mean, I really think that they are serving Trump a gift on a platter. I agree with you on those counts, but I want to hear your thoughts on what happens if this attempt does fail.
Well, I'll jump in real quick. Look, I think it's going to fail for a number of reasons, which we won't build on. First of all, let's get back to, you know, maybe I'm just nostalgic. I'm getting old enough to where I'm allowed to be nostalgic. But you know, I might be lambasted for this, but I always considered myself to be a Reagan Republican. And what that means is I'm somebody who believes in, in the vision of America, the hope and promise of America. And I also believe in the notion of bipartisan cooperation, where Republicans and Democrats can reach across the aisle and in working common cause to do, the best thing for America, even if it's not the best thing for their particular party. That may never have occurred. I may be living in a dream world, but that's the kind of America that I'm willing to fight for, willing to die for, willing to sacrifice for. I'm not willing to do all that for an America that is, has gravitated to this bipolar, strong, harsh, conservative, reactionary right wing and these radical left wing, and the people in the middle are left going, what the hell's happening here? If this impeachment fails, which I believe it will, it's not as though the left wing of the Democratic Party is just going to go away. They're going to become emboldened by this, empowered by this. You're going to see the middle ground disappear even further. And the same thing is going to happen to the right. Donald Trump is already destroying the Republican Party. I think that's a good thing, because I think the Republican Party, the way it's evolved, probably needs to be destroyed and reborn into something different. Hopefully that will happen with the Democratic Party as well. But be that as it may, so far there's nothing that's been able to emerge as a viable third party or replacement for these two parties. So I'm witnessing the increasing polarization of America. And I believe that Trump would get reelected. I believe that he would be emboldened by the failure of impeachment. And I believe that his anti-establishment tendencies will be magnified. And whatever we disagree with him in the past 4 years, we're going to find much more to disagree with him, because he will continue to attack an establishment he views as inherently disloyal. And in doing so, he is going to radicalize every aspect of the American body politic. And it's a very, very dangerous America that will emerge from this. And I wish the Democrats would just hit pause for a minute and understand that the best way to beat Donald Trump is to put a good candidate up for election in 2020, not to try and undermine American democracy by by trickery and deceit.
I'm sorry. The call for nostalgia here is I think inappropriate. It fit the current context, and the only place where we see bipartisan unity is on war policy. Okay, the current dust up. I support Trump's inclination to pull the U.S. troops out of Syria. I don't approve of the manner in which he has done it, and I think that he did take unnecessary risks and was impulsive. But the whole brouhaha that's being generated by both parties, who suddenly are these staunch defenders of the Kurds, well, not a single one of them would lift a finger to help create a Kurdish enclave or a Kurdistan in any of the nations where the Kurds are indigenous. And so this kind of false outrage over this move is the moment of bipartisanship. And that's really pretty fucked up.
Yeah. Well, and look, that's what's behind this impeachment. That's what's behind Russiagate, and that's what's behind Ukrainegate, is that they were afraid that Trump meant what he said about getting along with Russia, pulling out of the Middle East, making Japan and Germany pull their own weight. I mean, he never really did one time threaten to withdraw from NATO, but that's what they heard. He one time uttered that when it comes to Israel and Palestine, we ought to be fair. And the Israel lobby completely panicked. All the neoconservatives panicked and said, fair? Well, that would mean forcing the Israelis to stop doing what they're doing. So we can't have that. And they reacted against him as though he was some kind of enemy alien, when in fact, he's hawkish enough. They could have persuaded him, as they have persuaded him, to escalate every one of America's engagements, and including NATO and Eastern Europe and all the rest of this stuff. But that's why this whole impeachment thing, that's the context that I think it seems like you're missing, is that this is not finally the American people through their Congress are applying the rule of law and the Constitution to the presidency. This one has committed some crimes, so he's being removed. Instead, it's much more like a coup. And the Congress is playing a bit part in a whole scenario that was created by the intelligence community. So if this was the first one, and we all knew that, yeah, you know what, we should have impeached and removed and prosecuted Bill Clinton and George Bush and Barack Obama and Donald Trump and the next three presidents, because they are actual criminals and they do actually murder innocent people and break real laws. And if we were doing that, and this was going to be the first one of those, then that would be fine. If, for example, the House of Representatives really meant it about the rule of law, what they would do is they would impeach Donald Trump for the war crimes in Yemen, and then they would do everything they could to have him removed from office in the Senate for that, while insisting that he then be indicted along with former President Barack Obama, and that they both go to federal prison for war crimes, since Obama started that war in 2015 and oversaw it for 2 years, and then passed it to Trump, who's oversaw it for another 2 years, committing a deliberate war of genocide against a civilian population, destroying their water, electricity, hospitals, irrigation systems, and farm and every other thing that they can to destroy this population. And then they would show that, see, Barack Obama is in the Supermax prison with Donald Trump and Ted Kaczynski and Ramsey Youssef there in Florence, Colorado, where they belong. And now America believes in the rule of law. But see, this would be entirely different than what Scott Ritter was describing, where we have hardcore partisans on each side impeaching back and forth, the law dead, and politics simply being a fight. What we need is a consensus to impeach and imprison all of our presidents because of the real terrible things that they do. And if you look at what Donald Trump is doing in Yemen, he should get a medal for this meddling in Ukraine. Who cares at all about what he said to Zelensky on that phone call, compared to a deliberate policy, not collateral damage, a deliberate policy to lay a medieval siege on this population and somehow force the moms of the starving dead babies to force the Houthis to give up control of their capital city, which hasn't happened in 4.5 years. I mean, that is what should be going on. Bill Clinton was a guilty felon. George Bush and Barack Obama, both felons. There's no question whatsoever. George Bush came out and admitted, yes, I violated the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which is a felony statute, 5 million times. What are you going to do about it? And the answer was nothing. We can go on and on about him. Barack Obama, if you just want to boil it down to one charge, he used the CIA to murder an American citizen in Yemen, when he could have just as easy hired his sock puppet dictator Saleh to go and arrest the guy. Then he used the CIA to murder his son, who was just there to get him, who was no terrorist at all. So there's plenty of reason to impeach all presidents and for every president to be on notice. But that isn't what's going on here. Instead, what you have is a plot cooked up by the FBI Counterintelligence Division and John al-Nusra Brennan, who, that's his real worst crime, was being the leader of Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, which is actual high treason. And then his next biggest crime is falsely accusing President Trump of high treason in the entire Russiagate scam. And so, again, you know, if what was going on here was a real impeachment under the Constitution by the people through their Congress to hold a president accountable, then that'd be fine. I'd say get him on anything. And in fact, I supported the impeachment of Clinton on a perjury charge when I really wanted to see him go to prison for bombing the Branch Davidians and bombing Iraq. But I was willing to settle because it was the people versus him versus the state on the charges I wanted to see him removed on. And then at least what he did was a clear-cut felony, perjuring himself before a grand jury, which he would have overseen the government put any of us in prison for. But, you know, and then the rest of them all have a free pass, and we know how it goes. The way Nixon, they actually did have an article about Cambodia, and then they dropped it to get more votes. And so instead he was, you know, convicted for a cover-up for a minor crime instead of a secret, illegal, unconstitutional bombing campaign, which did I mention that the war in Yemen is completely unauthorized and illegal too, as well as treasonous and genocidal. That's why this whole thing is a giant hoax. It's the people who are perpetrating the genocide in Yemen who are worried that Donald Trump is going to back down on perpetrating all the genocides they want to perpetrate. And so I don't feel like giving them this victory. You know what I mean? John Kennedy, he should have been shot, but he should have got a trial first. Instead, the CIA took it upon themselves. And they don't have the right to do that.
Are you saying
Scott,
capital punishment against Kennedy is what you favored after a trial?
Well, he was a war criminal too. They're all war criminals. But I'm just saying there should have been a process: impeachment, removal, indictment, conviction, appeal. And then, you know what? Probably life in prison would be better. But what's the CIA do? They go, we don't like this guy anymore. And actually, I don't know that, but pretty seems like it.
Look, you just defined the character and the job description of an American president in the post-war era, which is you can't run an empire without a lot of violence, killing people, unfortunately. That's what they do. And there's definitely, as Peter said, a bipartisan consensus to support that. And they'll never go after a president for that, because that would put an end to the whole project. Scott Ritter, I think you wanted to jump in.
Again, I don't disagree with the notion that, you know, the establishment is the dreaded military-industrial congressional complex that Dwight Eisenhower warned us all about, and that there is bipartisan agreement, unfortunately, on continuing this establishment's viability, because that's what gives America credibility in the world. Not credibility in terms of moral credibility, but viability, I should perhaps say. It's what makes America America. Our ability to go anywhere, anytime, and bomb people into submission is unprecedented in world history. We might be seeing some retrograde on that, but that's what people are fighting against. The establishment is fighting against a geopolitical transition that's taking place today, where we see centers of power being formed with China, with Russia, with India, and others that put our viability at risk in terms of imposing itself. But this isn't what's dividing America. Look, frankly speaking, I can put 100 Americans in a room and ask them to point Syria out on the map, and the vast majority of them won't get it right. I can ask people to write an essay about the Kurds. They won't know what the hell they're talking about. They'll probably even spell Kurd wrong. And this is the level of ignorance that exists in the United States today about foreign policy, about national security policy. The military's become a football game because the NFL wears camouflaged uniforms on the sideline with the team. It's a NASCAR event because, God forbid, we don't allow the Army to recruit at NASCAR events. That's what war is. War, and even fewer Americans give a damn. What Americans care about is abortion. What Americans care about is the courts that will enable abortion. This is the true fight, and this is where Donald Trump is winning. He's stacking the courts with right-wing conservative judiciary, and this is why all of his supporters will forgive anything. They don't care about Zelensky. They don't care about Ukraine. They care about conservative, evangelical, Christian politics. And so long as Donald Trump is going to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg with another Kavanaugh, that's all they care about. That's what this has come down to, and frankly, that's what the left cares about. You don't see the left espousing, principled argument about war crimes committed in Yemen. You don't see the left espousing principled arguments about legitimizing American military intervention in Kurdistan. They're yelling and screaming because Donald Trump's doing it. If somebody else was doing it, it would be the right wing screaming against them. The point is, national security and foreign policy is a political football that's kicked for all the wrong reasons. It's kicked as a diversion against what's really taking place in the heart and soul of America, which is this ideological struggle that is manifesting itself with Supreme Court appointments. That's where the violence is going to take place, not because of Kurdistan, not because of Ukraine, because of the fact that Donald Trump has the ability to get the guaranteed fifth vote in the Supreme Court in place if he only can get reelected. And there's a lot of Americans that will resent the hell out of the Democrats for blocking what they think is their legitimate political right because they won the damn election and the Democrats are preventing them from winning another damn election.
Scott, I wanted to just, I'm glad you mentioned left and right, because I kind of chuckle when I hear Fox News and the Democrats themselves calling the Democrats the left and the Republicans the right. I don't think we have a left in America. Bill Clinton moved the Democratic Party to the center right with his new leadership council the triangulation, etc., the way Tony Blair did with Labour in Britain at the same time. So we have a right-wing party, the Republicans, and a center-right-wing party, the Democrats. There is no left. I just wanted to get that out. And in that context, I want to talk about Rudy Giuliani, because I grew up in New York City. He was my mayor. I never liked Rudy Giuliani. I always saw him as a right-wing, law and order guy. And also when he ran for president briefly, he laughed at the notion that the 9/11 may have been a response to U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and their interventions there. He thought that was absurd. So Rudy Giuliani was never high on my list. But if you're going to do serious journalism, I think you have to put aside people's ideological baggage, their backgrounds, their parties, and look at the facts they may be presenting. And when I see him go on Fox News, and I see him talking about what the information he's gotten in the various trips he's made to Ukraine, that I think he's been feeding to John Solomon, I don't know that for sure, but he talks about, for example, Viktor Shokin, who was the fired prosecutor that Biden withheld the money in order to get fired. He got a hold of this affidavit in which Shokin says that's why he was fired. He has also got a lot of stuff, and Scott Horton knows more about this. I'd like him to talk a little bit about it. The ledger that was involved in getting Trump's first campaign manager investigating kicked off. So Giuliani's been going right on TV, on Fox, almost every night, saying extraordinary things that he says he has and that he's still finding out about the role of the Democrats in the 2016 election working with Ukraine to hurt Trump. And then, of course, about Biden and the clear conflict of interest he had with his son. And then what do we have? We have a letter from the Biden campaign to all the networks saying, do not put Giuliani on anymore. Giuliani. Can you imagine that? A political campaign telling networks who they can or cannot interview. So Giuliani is, as in his role as the personal lawyer of Donald Trump, was defending Trump from before the time the Mueller report came out, before Biden declared presidency. So he was working on this as a way to defend Trump against the Russiagate charges. And now that he's working in tandem, it seems, with Durham and Barr, who I also don't have a lot of confidence in. I have more confidence in Giuliani, actually, to try to get to the bottom of what happened there. So he's become a target in my scheme, that this is a preemptive move to protect themselves from anything that might come out about what involvement intelligence agencies had. They're getting back at him for going after the intelligence agencies, and Giuliani's become their big target. So they've indicted 4 associates of his. So by association, Rudy is guilty. Now he's being investigated. The New York Times ran a retrospective the other day of his whole career as if he's finished. So there's a concerted effort to go after Giuliani. And I know some people, they seem like they can't get over their ideological disagreement with Giuliani. I think he's a fool and he's doing the same old crap that he always did. And there are others who just don't buy what he's saying. And I take seriously what he's saying and what he's coming up with. And I think the witch hunt is after him personally, because they need to stop whatever could come out of Ukraine about 2016. Peter, you said something about Giuliani earlier, so I want to start with you.
I can't give him any credibility, Joe. I think that he is an opportunist. We once again have a case of somebody who claims to be working for Trump for free. We know he doesn't pay his bills anyway, so maybe it's just to avoid the collection process. But, he has no official status. If Trump had said, he's my special envoy, it's very easy to give him some sort of status, but he's operating as a total freelancer. And the testimony, I can't call it evidence at this point, but the leaked testimony of Yovanovitch, of Volker, of Fiona Hill, these all raise serious questions. And the report that he basically picked up Mike Flynn's account with Turkey and was chasing the alleged $15 million bounty for the extradition of Fethullah Gulen. I'm sorry, he's really dirty. And if he can come up with evidence, I will evaluate that evidence. But I can't really summon a word in defense of Giuliani's behavior as it has been reported to date.
Peter, one thing I will say is if he was, in fact, running the Ukraine foreign policy, that would be improper, to say the least. I don't know if he's done that. That's what seemed to have come out late this week. So there is a law. I'm trying to remember the name of it. One of you guys know that bars private citizens from getting involved in diplomacy. So he's working as a lawyer for the president, and he has a right to defend him. And I think going into Ukraine to try to get to the beginnings of Russiagate and all that is proper. If he's actually running the country's foreign policy towards Ukraine, that's another issue.
Wait, Joe.
Yeah.
Trump controls the government, the executive branch. This is appropriate for the Justice Department to investigate.
Right.
It's not appropriate just to have your crony lawyer who knows some of your secrets, on the prowl over there. I'm sorry, it's way out of bounds.
His argument is, Giuliani's argument is that he's his lawyer and that he was being charged.
He has said that he's not operating as a lawyer in this regard.
Really? That's not what I heard. He was there defending Trump against the Russiagate allegations, so he's doing his due diligence. And frankly, from what we said about Barr and Durham, maybe that's why he's taken on a bigger role here, because he maybe doesn't trust Barr and Durham to get to the bottom of this. So I get he could cross a line if he's starting to run the foreign policy and taking over from the State Department. Although he also said the State Department asked him to go there and do this. I don't know if you've seen this. You don't believe them? Well,
I believe that. No.
Okay. Well, that's what he says. So he's lying then. I mean, he says he could show the documents, the emails where he was ordered or asked by the State Department.
Yeah, he holds up his phone and claims that. He hasn't produced anything that's credible.
Well, the Victor Shokin and affidavit seem to come from him. That's just one thing.
Right. I read that, and I think that is interesting. But I think we need to depose Shokin and really evaluate him much more,
I agree.
Deeply.
And I'd like to see Giuliani go on the witness stand in an impeachment hearing in the Senate if they're going to actually try to convict him, or in some other venue in front of the Intelligence Committee or the House Judiciary Committee. He said he'd do that if he's allowed to bring PowerPoints and show documents and whatnot. That's what he said.
Well, Lindsey Graham has invited him to come to Senate Judiciary. I'll hear him out. But all I'm saying is that everything that has been reported so far only damages his credibility, and it makes him seem like a very selective investigator who is not just going in and digging to discover the truth, but is trying to confirm some very specific arguments. Like, where is any evidence about a CrowdStrike server in Ukraine? Does anybody have anything that backs that up?
Well, we haven't heard about that, but maybe they did. And as Scott Horton has pointed out, they were involved. Of course, Ukraine, CrowdStrike had a contract in Ukraine, and they falsely accused the Russians of hacking into Russian howitzers on the battlefield in the Donbass. And it turned out that was the same program that they used to say that Russia hacked the DNC's computer. So there's some kind of they had a contract in Ukraine. Dmitry Alperovich, who is one of the directors of the company, is not a Ukrainian. He's a Russian, an anti-Putin Russian, but he's not Ukrainian. So I don't know if the link is there, but I don't know what they may have heard. Trump says they heard this. Now, he's a fabulist. He could have just made this up. That's possible. But I think all avenues should be looked at to find the server and to examine it, which the FBI should have done. The two Scots are very silent here. Do you have anything to say about Giuliani or any of this?
Giuliani, first of all, is a bad person, but he's also, I think, way too old to be competent at all. And I think, does make the whole thing look corrupt even by showing up. He, smacks of corruption and arrogance and every kind of thing. There's a reason why people hate him so much and always have. And I agree with you that it makes sense that they would be worried that maybe Barr and Durham are only ever going to go so far against the institutions who are behind this scam. And so maybe he felt like he had to hire his own personal lawyer to get involved here, which politically speaking looks pretty bad and is part of the error that got him in all this trouble here. But on the other hand, aren't there a lot of lawyers in New York City? He had to go with this guy to be the one to go over and do this, because I think that, in fact, the server example is a great example. Trump says to Zelensky, hey, I hear that the server is there in Ukraine somewhere. What, the DNC server? Is that what he's talking about? He thinks that CrowdStrike took the DNC server to Ukraine and hid it somewhere, something. Where could he have possibly gotten that? And the answer is either he just has no idea what he's talking about, or he's parroting something that Giuliani told him. And I think Giuliani is just the kind of idiot to not be able to filter out between which angles are we investigating here and which angles, belong on the internet but aren't really worth pursuing. And so I think, on this whole scandal, the worst thing that Trump's done, he's guilty of felony stupidity for involving Giuliani, and then, as you were saying earlier, getting involved on the phone call himself, when the obvious thing here is just to say to Barr, which I think would be appropriate, that like, hey, in your investigation, make sure and figure out where that Manafort ledger came from, and make sure and find out if there's corruption involving any American politicians or anything. Right? That's all he has to say, and say it to his attorney general, and then let that go, I guess, as far as it could. But you know what? I mean, the deal here is, again, you zoom out on the left side and the CIA side, they're on a fishing expedition, but they think that's fine. This guy is unfit. This guy must be stopped. He must be removed. Whatever we can get on him, we've got to come up with something. And so, look, how long do you have to wait before Donald Trump makes a major ethical lapse? Just a week or so, and something new will come up. And so they have something to pin on him here. But on the other side, they're saying, but actually, he's not that bad, and we voted for him, and you guys are just on a fishing expedition looking for anything. You got this kind of process crime, which, as Peter was saying, is kind of complicated. And, as Andrew Coburn was joking on my show, ain't it something? The thing that Donald Trump is in the most trouble for this whole presidency long so far is holding up an arms deal. Really? This is what we're going to the mat over, is this whole thing, And I actually thought at first that maybe this was like a Roger Stone, Karl Rove psyop, like the George Bush National Guard papers or whatever. That how do we get the Democrats to make Joe Biden their front runner for the presidency, him and his son's corruption, their number one issue to try to use against Trump? Hey, Joey, come here. You want to be a whistleblower? Here's what you do. And then they just set this whole thing up. I'm just making that up being funny. But they might as well have done it that way, because look at what the Democrats have done. They're like, yeah, our front runner, him and his son, they're as corrupt as a day is long, but it's not fair for Donald Trump to be asking questions about it. Let's impeach him for that. And, I mean, how stupid can they be? It's the worst politics that they could have ever embarked on. And here they are. And Biden's crashing in the polls. I mean, what are they going to do? They're really going to run on Hunter Biden can do whatever he wants. He can make as much money as he wants doing nothing and spend it all on coke and whores, and there's no comeuppance ever because he's a Biden. Is that is that what they're really running on?
Well, he's down to $9 million
against Trump with this.
He's down to $9 million apparently in his campaign.
And it was the Washington Post that. The Washington Post quoted his ex-wife saying he spent it all on coke and whores.
I think that he spent more on coke and whores than his father has left to campaign on right now, which is only $9 million.
Right.
So there's this conspiracy theory out there that Hillary Clinton is behind trying to get Biden out of the way.
Can I mention one more Biden scandal here?
Please.
Let's talk about how Biden killed his other son, by starting Iraq War II. Where his son got brain cancer from living next to a burn pit full of carcinogens. And that, to me, is the real Biden and son scandal that nobody's talking about. How come Bo is dead? How come Bo's widow was available for Hunter to bang while he was dying? It was because his father had given him brain cancer by invading Iraq and sending him there.
I'm going to change the subject quickly after that. I think there's another scandal here, and that's the way the media has covered this. And I mean, we have seen a complete breakdown into partisanship on both sides now. It's total, it's complete. There's no idea of nonpartisan journalism looking at the facts here, as I'm trying to do. And I never liked Giuliani. Like I said, here I am coming off defending him, and maybe you guys are right about him. But when you see, and I did a piece on this, Jane Meyer in The New Yorker, never mentioning Biden's appearance at the Council on Foreign Relations, never mentioning the Shokin affidavit that, yes, that's why he was fired, because Biden wanted him fired. He was withholding the way they're covering up for Biden, just with this conspiracy theorist mantra that's going on and on and on, and saying there's no evidence. There's no evidence of Biden. They just wanted to cut this off. This is complete malpractice when it comes to journalism. To try to defend a political party and a candidate instead of looking at everybody who might be corrupt here. And there's a lot of people we could be looking at. Scott, Ritter, you've been patiently sitting there.
Look, the corruption of the media is part and parcel of the corruption of the American body politic. When we speak about, let's go back to Giuliani for a second. When we speak of Giuliani, what are we talking about? Why would President Trump feel the need to turn to Rudy Giuliani to do this? It's because he doesn't trust the establishment. I mean, who would he turn to? The State Department? Not on your life. Who would he turn to? The Justice Department? Not on your life. The intelligence community? No. The mainstream media to do a legitimate investigation? Absolutely not. And it's not as though Trump has a stable of establishment-linked lawyers. What I mean by that are people that can carry out this kind of investigation. What he has is a bunch of sycophantic, ass-kissing, has-beens, wannabes, people who can't challenge Trump, politically, and he empowers them, partially. And I think that's what's happening with Rudy Giuliani. To speak to the credibility of his investigation, the process stinks, but the process stinks because, the process, in order to be a credible process, you have to engage the establishment. And Trump isn't going to do that. Trump is at war with the establishment. I think Rudy Giuliani is a manifestation of that. Now, let's turn to your question about the media. I'm one of these naive people that when I nostalgia that I might be condemned for, I go back to my time in college, and I remember my government professors, my history professors saying, one of the things that you have to do is go get that that student discount subscription to the Washington Post and the New York Times. And we were allowed to quote both of those newspapers as uncontested, unquestioned fact. If it appeared in those newspapers, it could be footnoted anywhere we wanted to in a government or history paper and would never be questioned. So I thought that these newspapers were actually viable. I got a rude awakening when I was at the United Nations, seeing how things that I was personally involved in, not just involved peripherally, but was running, operations that I was running in Iraq, meetings that I was a central player to at the Security Council, being reported to the media and how the media spun it. And you knew who was leaking the information. You knew who was running out and calling, the Barbara Cressettes of the world, the Judy Millers of the world. And you knew why they were doing it. But what I didn't understand is why would the New York Times run with this story when they know absolutely that it's false? And it's because the New York Times isn't beholden to the truth. The mainstream media isn't beholden to the truth. They're beholden to the source. They're beholden to the source that feeds them the story, that gets them the headlines, that allows them to generate advertising dollars, subscription numbers, etc. And I saw this when I left the UN, and I was hired by CNN, I was hired by NBC, I was hired by Fox, and they actually let me in behind the green door, and I got to see how news was made. It is the most corrupt, dishonest, disingenuous process you'll ever see in your life. I was released by NBC News because I empowered Claire Shipman to ask questions of Sandy Berger that would expose him as a liar. When Sandy Berger heard the questions, the word got back to NBC. If you continue your relationship with NBC, with Scott Ritter, we're going to deny you access to the White House briefings. That's the reality of the mainstream media today. That's what's taking place. They're part of the corruption of truth. They're part of the corruption of integrity. They're part of the corruption of everything that's supposed to make America great. And I have no use for them. I think I'm wearing my heart on my sleeve on this one.
Scott, I'll embrace your nostalgia in this case.
Well, Scott, yes, go on, Peter.
Well, we don't have a functioning fourth estate. And let me just use a non-political example, okay? I'm one of those people who's critical of the rollout of 5G wireless, which has not been submitted to any testing for its increased radiation on human beings. The New York Times and the Washington Post both have very high dollar deals with Verizon to promote 5G. And so we're not seeing any critical reporting. And beyond the health issues, 5G is being crammed down local communities where they can't restrict where the towers are, where the boxes are. And also, it's a huge reduction in payments for the use of right-of-way. And this is not being discussed in either newspaper. And so the yellow journalism, the bias, the commercial control is not limited to the political sphere.
In either newspaper, and I'm sure that the Bay Area had more than just two. New York City used to have 8 at one time. By the way, Scott, I was in the UN press corps in those days, and I didn't get those leaks from those sources. But in any case, I think that's a good time to wrap it up. We've had a pretty freewheeling discussion about the impeachment issue that is not going away anytime soon. So I got a feeling I'll be seeing you guys back maybe a little bit later on to see where we're at that time. So let me thank the two Scotts, Horton in Austin, Scott Ritter in upstate New York, and Peter B. Collins in the San Francisco Bay Area. You've been watching CN Live's discussion of the impeachment of Donald Trump.